Economic sanctions. Macroeconomic measures aimed at the entire economy of a state and its civilian population. Sanctions as a tool of foreign policy have been long debated by politicians like Obama as to whether they ought to be used. Proponents point to their claimed successes in removing dictators from power and preventing harms such as genocide. Opponents have simply to show the statistics of the many suffering innocent civilians oppressed and killed to prove their point. Here's a brief summary.
Economic sanctions have been used by the international community for decades to pressure countries to change what is seen as bad behavior. Sometimes they're considered a success. In South Africa, international sanctions were widely credited with helping to end apartheid. Many times they fail. U.S. sanctions on the Cuban government have been in place for more than 40 years, but did nothing to weaken former ruler Fidel Castro's grip on power. Critics argue that sanctions hurt ordinary civilians more than the leaders who are targeted.
Today's much smaller question is simply whether sanctions uphold national security while simultaneously protecting constitutional rights. The issue of sanctions largely sidesteps this question because the citizens being harmed are not American and thus not guaranteed constitutional rights. However, we will argue that national security should override constitutional rights in the majority of instances, sanctions being an example of the importance of national security. The historical background of sanctions has typically been one of conflict, with sanctions being imposed to try to weaken one state in order for another to have a military advantage, or to have the target state acquiesce to the sender state's economic wishes. The effects on civilians, however, are unacceptable. Seattle PI explains several specific impacts from the comprehensive sanctions placed on Iraq. The sanctions imposed on Iraq have prevented the country from repairing its destroyed infrastructure. That has affected the quality of life of countless Iraqis, especially those belonging to the middle and lower economic levels, who do not have alternatives to the effects of sanctions. The vast majority of Iraq's people have been on semi-starvation diet for years. The reduction in the import of medicines has crippled healthcare services. And from 1991 to 98, children under 5 died from malnutrition-related diseases in numbers of approximately 5,000 per month. If these harms were occurring to American citizens on American soil, the US would be the first to loudly call for the end of sanctions. This illustrates the discrepancy between American citizens and those of other nations, the double standard between the US and the rest of the world. The US justifies this double standard, however, with its exceptionalist mindset, which is another project entirely. Sanctions avoid the conflict between national security and constitutional principles because the US has never, and I'm willing to bet never will, impose sanctions on itself. However, when the two conflict, national security should take precedence over constitutional rights for several reasons. First, national security is simply a collective of individual constitutional rights, so when the nation as a whole is protected, the vast majority of individual rights in that nation are also protected. Second, the United States' reasoning for decision-making upholds the thought of national security taking precedence over constitutional rights. According to Joy Gordon, in early 2001, the U.S. placed holds on $280 million in medical supplies, including vaccines to treat infant hepatitis, tetanus, and diphtheria, as well as incubators and cardiac equipment. The rationale was that the vaccines contained live cultures. The Iraqi government, it was argued, could conceivably extract them and eventually grow a virulent fatal strain, then develop a missile or other delivery system that could effectually disseminate it. End quote. While this clearly demonstrates the way in which national security has been called upon as justification for sanctions, it also shows that the concept of national security has been exploited to justify inherently wrong policies. Stopping the flow of arms to a war-torn country is one thing, cutting off infants' vaccines are another. To clarify, we argue that national security, when sufficiently threatened, should override constitutional rights, not simply whenever the US government calls for it. Yes, I know the term sufficiently is slightly vague, but come on, this is an iMovie project, not the US legislature, so we got a little leeway. Chomsky furthers,
the real reasons for the attack on Iran, the sanctions and so on, go back into history. I mean, we like to forget the history, Iranians don't. In 1953, the United States and Britain overthrew the parliamentary government and installed a brutal dictator, the Shah, who ruled until 1979. And during his rule, incidentally, the United States was strongly supporting the same programs that are objecting to today. In 1979, the population overthrew the dictator. And since then, the United States has been essentially torturing Iran. First, it tried a military coup, then it supported Saddam Hussein during Iraq's invasion of Iran. which killed hundreds of thousands of people. And then after that was over, the United States started imposing harsh sanctions on Iran, and now it's escalating that. The point is, it's supposed to be a U.S. client state, as it was under the Shah, and it's refusing to play that role.
The third justification for national security overriding constitutional rights is that rights cannot be inviolable. If they were, the US government could never take an action that would harm a single American citizen, even if the reason was to prevent more rights violations to more citizens from something such as a terrorist attack. This would paralyze policy action, and the US government would stop functioning. It is for these reasons that we believe national security should be prioritized over constitutional rights in most circumstances. We conclude with a quote from former President George W. Bush. "One of the things important about history is to remember the true history. Truth is, sanctions have often been used under the guise of national security to achieve desirable effects in foreign nations with thousands of gratuitous deaths. If we use this knowledge to prevent future atrocities, the innocent lives lost will decrease significantly with use of sanctions."